In this lecture, we were asking the questions, what is the world and who are we? And we're talking about the doctrine or the teaching of creation. Some of the heresies that surround the doctrine of creation and how the church responded by the use of creeds. And then we're going to touch just very quickly on the relationship between creation and science. The Christian church has always believed that God is creator of the world and everything in it. In the Hebrew Scriptures, which Christians call the Old Testament, this is addressed at the very beginning. If you grab a Bible and you open it up to the very first book, you'll find the book of Genesis. And the very first chapter talks about how God created the world and everything around us. Genesis 1:1 says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth." And then the New Testament has affirmed this belief that God has created all things, that God is the creator of everything. It's affirmed in Scripture, in creeds, by councils and hymns, and other worship materials as well. There is a creed called the Apostles' Creed that many faith traditions recite every Sunday. And that creed begins by saying, "I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth." But there were some in the early church who did not support this idea that God created the world. Not all who joined the early Christian church were raised to believe that the world was created good. Not all believed that it was the work of the one God revealed in Jesus Christ. And so there were some who believed that this material world, this world in which we live in, was not good. Some believe that everything that is material is in fact evil. And it is really only the soul that's good. In other words, your spirit is good, but your flesh, your body is bad. It's evil. In Genesis, when God created the world, we read that God said that God's creation was good. God called the creation of the world good. And God called the creation of human beings very good. In the beginning, humans were formed out of the dust of the earth. God breathed life into humanity. God created human beings and made humans in God's very own image. But we can acknowledge that we still have sin in our lives. As in the Christian faith, we believe that sin separates us from God and the people that God calls us to be. And we see this played out very explicitly in the story of Adam and Eve. In the book of Genesis, God tells them, don't eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They're given the free range to eat from any fruit in the garden except from the fruit of this one tree. And then the serpent comes and tempts them to eat the fruit. And they disobey God, their eyes are opened, and sin at that point is brought into the world. And so this story has often been called the fall. But it represents this fall from grace where we as humans first experience shame and guilt and sin. And sin is a reality that we live with every day of our lives. We don't have to go far to find examples of sin lived out through bigotry, through hatred, through violence. And in the New Testament, we see often the Apostle Paul talk about our sinful nature. In some translations, Paul refers to it as the flesh. For example, you may have heard the phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. So in the New Revised Standard Version of that passage, it says, what the flesh desires is opposed to the spirit. What the spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. And the truth is, that's just really a bad translation. Paul often jockeyed the word flesh and the word spirit. And unfortunately, because of these translations, people think that our flesh is bad. But our flesh, our humanness, does not equal our sin. Remember that we are made from the dust, that we bear the image of God. Our bodies are created by God and called very good. And even Jesus came from heaven and was incarnated, which means God came down and took on flesh. So flesh itself is not bad. It can't be bad. Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan monk and theologian, talks about that word that Paul uses for flesh. And in the original Greek language, which this is being written in, Paul uses the word sarx, S-A-R-X. And a better translation of that word, a more accurate translation of that word, is actually the word ego. In other words, Paul is talking about our selfish desires that motivate us to act against how God has called us to act. We could say our spirit is willing, but our egos, our selfish desires, make us weak. So Paul's not really talking about our flesh. He's talking about our ego. But Plato left a big impact on the belief of many Christians when it comes to the purpose of the world. The Platonic tradition taught us that the world was not created by a supreme being, but instead it was created by a secondary, lesser being. And the material world is a lesser copy of the higher world of ideas. Okay? So Plato argued that the body was essentially a prison, a cell for the soul. It could only be freed, your soul could only be freed by thinking. And so the Christian church, of course, rejected this view. But it still kind of crept into its way into the life of the church. In fact, this view is still very popular among people today. One heretical group in particular that held this view in the early church were the Gnostics. And the word gnosis means knowledge. They claimed to have this special knowledge which was secretly revealed to them. And only those who have this secret knowledge are able to set free from the physical world and find salvation. And so they believed that there was the reason for our suffering in this world was because your body is evil and you're trapped in this flesh prison. And so you had to break free through thinking in your mind. Another heretical group came from Marcion. And Marcion believed that there was not only one God, but there were two gods. And so the first God is the God of the Old Testament, which we call Yahweh. And this God is vengeful and ignorant. And this God created the world with all its imperfections and then just kind of placed human beings there and left. And then the second God is the supreme God, the Father of Jesus Christ, and kind of lived out through Jesus Christ. And so that God is kind and loving and forgiving, and that God would never create an imperfect world where there's evil. And so Marcion said that everything having to do with the body must be evil and polluted and wrong because it was made by that first God. And so you have to avoid all material bodily things. And Jesus is the only one who comes to kind of free us from our physical bodies. Marcion said that because the body is evil, then Jesus didn't really come in the flesh. Not really. He didn't actually have a body, according to Marcion, but he only appeared to have a body. He wasn't really born of Mary, but he only looked like he was born of Mary. Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but he just only looked like he died on the cross. It was all this big magic trick, right? It was an illusion. And some people still view this and think this today. Some folks still believe and agree with these ideas. There's an influence placed on the spiritual. And people sometimes forget that God created our human bodies. And in Genesis 1, we're told that God called us good. And so the church responds to these heretical views with the use of creeds. Now, the two most known creeds today are the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. The Apostles' Creed was composed by the early church and was being circulated around the year 150 AD. The Nicene Creed was composed a little bit later during the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD. And this was considered to kind of be the first council of the church, the Nicene Council. And there would be many, many more to follow. One example would be the Council of Constantinople, which happened in 381, made some additions to the Nicene Creed, but creeds are really used as a statement of affirmation of faith. They're used to say, hey, this is what we believe as a church. This is a statement of what we think, of what we believe, of what we claim in the Christian faith. And so both of these creeds affirm that God is indeed the creator and ruler of all. The Greek word pantocrator, it means all, means government. And so it essentially means ruler of all, governor of all. And so these creeds affirm that God is the ruler of all, that God governs the world and everything in it. And so now we're going to switch gears a little bit, talk just very shortly about the relationship between creation and science. Christians believe that God created all things ex nihilo, which is a fancy word of saying out of nothing. When we make things, we need materials. If I want to go out and I want to build a coffee table or a bookcase, then I've got to go buy wood, I've got to get a hammer and nails and all the materials that I'm going to need to make that. But God created everything out of nothing, meaning there were no raw materials laying around. God couldn't go to Home Depot and pick up some wood to create the world. So God instead created by speaking things into existence. For example, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. In the 13th century, a debate arose about this idea of whether God had really made things out of nothing or out of pre-existing material. Later, Charles Darwin held this theory of survival of the fittest and this idea of evolution. Then there were debates about the denial of creation as it's described in the first few chapters of Genesis. And so all of these debates about science created rifts with many in the science world versus those in the world of religion. Now, what is the relationship between faith and science? Are they compatible? Can you reconcile the data of science with the belief of faith? These are age-old questions, and Christians believe different things about this. So we're going to take a look at the example of creation. So some Christians try to reconcile Scripture and science when it comes to creation. They say that the 6 days of creation is not literal, it's metaphorical. Creation actually occurred over time, it occurred in stages, it was a process, and that's something that science would back up as well. Others would say, well, there's no conflict at all. We don't have to make anything work. We can just know, because it's just important to know that God's the one who created the world. It doesn't really matter how God did it, but just the fact that God did it is the thing that we needed to know. Still, others hold on to the belief that the Bible should be taken literally, that God literally created the world in 6 literal days, and God literally rested on the 7th day. They claim that Scripture is always right, so science must be wrong. And we can see how there are all sorts of problems with this understanding of this approach to the relationship between faith and science. But I like the way that Perez and Gonzalez frame this relationship in their book, Christian Theology. They write, "The doctrine of creation does not mean only that God made the world and set it in motion, but also that God keeps it and sustains it in existence. Therefore, the laws of nature that science studies, for instance, the law of gravity, are part of the creating and sustaining action of God." I like what the American physician-scientist Francis Collins says on the subject. He writes, "Will we turn our backs on science because it is perceived as a threat to God, abandoning all the promise of advancing our understanding of nature and applying that to the alleviation of suffering and the betterment of humankind? Alternatively, will we turn our backs on faith, concluding that science has rendered the spiritual life no longer necessary, and that traditional religious symbols can now be replaced by engravings of the double helix on our altars?" Both of these choices are profoundly dangerous. Both deny truth. Both will diminish the nobility of humankind. Both will be devastating to our future, and both are unnecessary. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. He can be worshipped in the cathedral or in the laboratory. His creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful, and it cannot be at war with itself. Only we imperfect humans can start such battles, and only we can end them. In the end, we can say that there is room for both faith and science, not only to exist alongside each other, but to work together, to be compatible, to enhance one another. And so we can see that God created the world in the Christian faith. You claim that, you see that in the creeds, and then it's backed up in how we view the way that faith and science can come together and work together as well.